Welcome to Document Imaging and Problem Solving. The objectives for this have more to do with the document imaging than it does some of the problem solving. We're going to understand the necessity of scanning in the electronic medical record, electronic health record, review the importance of preparing documents prior to scanning and how the attention to detail when you go to actually scan the document, file types and storage, hardware and software, and indexing and retrieval. So what are some of the reasons that you might want to scan when you have an electronic medical record or electronic health record? The first and main reason is any documents that are created outside of the organization you're working in. Those would be things like photo IDs or driver's license, insurance cards, power of attorneys, posts or advance directives, pertinent medical records from another facility that have been printed out, or EMS, the trip reports, the ambulance report or fire department report. As we move forward with health information exchange, some of this type of information potentially can be integrated into the electronic medical record and actual data, whether that's OCR technology or even an integrated system where the information that is entered goes up into the cloud and then that information can be retrieved by the organization. Some documents that are created inside the organization would be anything that's non-interfaced or non-integrated clinical documentation. Some of those things might be in the form of EEG monitoring strips, EKGs sometimes cannot be integrated or aren't integrated at a health facility yet, fetal monitoring strips. There could be a variety of different documentation that is not integrated or there isn't a place to put it. Sometimes the documentation just hasn't been created yet because it's either complicated documentation or it hasn't been feasible. The way the documentation is done doesn't make sense in the electronic world. At the hospital I work at, some of those examples can be sedation, the minute-by-minute documentation of the amount of medication that a patient is given in conjunction with how they're acting and how their vital signs are, and the double signing of a doctor and a nurse has been a challenge to recreate, and it was more important to get the system up and running than to worry about recreating that documentation. Documentation that requires any signed consent. There are signature pads, and anybody that's been to a couple of the hospitals know that you can sign that you're agreeing to allow them to take care of you. Your condition for admissions or your condition for service can be signed, but there's other documents for a variety of reasons that cannot be created where it allows you for a signature line. Some of its limitations of the actual software, some of its limitations of time and resources to create those documents in order to get them integrated with an electronic signature. So anytime you have a signed document, you have to have that on file and you have to scan it in. And those are just some examples. So in preparing the document, there's some basic things. I'm going to talk about in another slide in the days of faxing. Any of those of you that have been around when documents were faxed a lot, it was the same kind of thing, right? We couldn't have staples or paper clips or brads, dog-eared corners. The edges have to be straight, or when you set them into the scanner, make sure that it's setting straight in the feeder, in the guide, that the size and shape's appropriate. You can't put a little tiny receipt in a pull-through scan. You'd either have to lay it flat on a flatbed or potentially make copies of it first. And then colored backgrounds can also be a problem. So let's look at a few of these in more attention to detail. And again, I'm referring back to the days of faxing or photocopying. You couldn't have a dark background, and if you look here, here's an example of, a darker typed background, and you can see it's very hard to read some of the legibility of the numbers, which is also important on the type of surface, and we're going to get to that in a couple slides, but the surface that the person is writing on can make a difference too. Here we have a color blue, and when you've all seen this too, on a copy machine even, you can get some pixelation or some dark colors because of how dark that was. So it's important for preparing documents from the outside, but it's also important when you are creating your documents within the organization that are going to remain on paper. And some of you that have either worked in medical facilities or even potentially in the jobs that you have outside of medicine, particular items or documents that people want you to take note of might be fluorescent orange or fluorescent green or hot pink or something to get your attention. You know, when you see this document, it means something special. In the medical world, we've done very similar things, right? If it was fluorescent yellow, it meant something, or a particular shade of pink, it was to get your attention. It's a struggle to do that when you're having scanned documents, because even though we could account for it, it's too time consuming and not efficient to have to manipulate either the scanner or the software receiving the scan to make it so that it's not coming in this way, to change it so it comes in this way. And apologize for clicking around there. Computer's getting ahead of me. Some of the ways that you can do some of that troubleshooting and correct this first is sometimes there's corrective application software. We're going to get more into hardware and software in one of the other slides, but you may have software that when the image comes in, it allows you to clean it up, to straighten it, to lighten the background a little and make some corrections so that it's legible. Again, depending on who the scanner is and where the area is they're scanning, that's something that takes time, and you may not have time to always be worried about correcting it after it's scanned, so it's important to get the document prepared to scan. You might need to photocopy it first. You've got to decide whether it's in black and white or color scanning. Sometimes images, if it's a particular photograph or image that you can't import because it's from another facility, radiographic or diagnostic imaging type thermal papers, things like that, you might have to find a way to, or get creative with how you prepare them so that they're the right size of paper, and also color versus black and white, grayscale versus photo when you go to scan those items in, so that you get the best quality picture on the first take. The type of ink, and if, again, back to the faxing days, back to check writing days, they didn't want you to use red ink or light colored ink, or when gel pens came out, pink or purple, blue, light blue ink, because they don't show up in photocopy as well. And this example is not a really good one, but what I was trying to show is there's some areas where you can tell they wrote a little harder or potentially a different color ink, and then towards the bottom here you can see how it fades out, and it's hard to read it as it gets lighter. And when we talk about like a blotter, or back in the days when we had, the calendars that covered up the whole desk, that thickness of paper, mouse pad type thickness, if it's not too soft to poke through, can often allow the pressure of the pen to make better contact. Fine tipped pens versus rollerball pens, gel ink versus ballpoint ink, all of those things should be considered when you're in places where those documents are going to be created prior to scanning. So like at the registration desk where we're collecting signatures, or at the bedside for consent, should potentially think about those types of writing devices, types of ink, types of pens, colors of the ink and the pens, and potentially a good surface for the patient to actually make their signature on, or to be written on. Wrinkles. Sometimes you'll get documents that actually already come pre-wrinkled, if there's such a thing. Either the patient had the medical records in their pocket, or just because of the way they came in the envelope with the patient, they could have turned corners. So trying to straighten those out prior to scanning is very important. Sometimes dangerous. It's very dangerous. Here's a big caveat. But you know how when you go to feed your dollar bills into a vending machine, right? You can rub them on the edge of a surface and kind of straighten them out. You can do the same thing with any piece of paper, but please be careful not to rip it. It'll be harder to scan once you've torn it than not. The other thing is, a lot of places when they're doing heavy scanning will have a multi-page pull-through scan, which we're going to get into a little bit later, versus a flatbed scanner. And if you have a wrinkled document, sometimes it's easier on a flatbed scanner to put some pressure on it and get it nice and flat versus trying to have it pull through a scanner that's feeding it automatically. But you can see how difficult in these pictures it would be to read it if it came in skewed. You might miss crucial information at the end of a sentence, get cut off. It's just hard to read because it's skewed, it's at an angle. Some other things you could do is actually trim the edges to make it square, or potentially photocopy it again first so that you get it centered and nice and square on the piece of paper before you feed it through. There is also software that will help you do the same thing, but again, we're talking about which takes the least amount of time, and particular if it's a piece of software you're not used to using, it might be faster to make a good photocopy and then feed it through the scanner, particularly on a multifunction machine that has the copier and the scanner all integrated, than it is to try to scan a document and potentially get the feeder stuck or have it come in so wrinkled that you can't fix it with the application software, and then going back and forth and retrying it and manipulating software you're not familiar with. So those things are all important to think of when you're scanning. So file types and sizes. This comes into play when you're talking about service support at a service desk, when users may have file types to choose from and they're calling asking what file type they should use. It's important when you're doing strategic planning or project management, you've got to estimate the storage sizes that you need, or the amount of storage that you need, and also the quality. You might have different types of file types depending on the types of document you're scanning. So plain text versus things with images versus things with photographs in them may be treated differently, and it potentially can be quite a job to try to estimate how much that's going to take. When you're converting a whole doctor's office or archived medical records that might be in the form of paper, with paper file charts, and getting some of that historical data scanned in, you have to start to make those decisions. Sometimes it's at the level that you might be doing this, you're making a plan and saying we're only going to scan in the last year's worth or the last 5 years worth of documents, but anything older than 5 years or older than 2 years, you might outsource to a company that does this type of mass scanning and puts it into different file formats, and it's determined that, images aside, you just need the text in there so that you can refer back to it, but it's being archived. It's not really for daily use. So you can estimate the number of scanned pages per day, do a little bit of math. There's a couple websites here that have some good information, and a table talks about how big those sizes are and how they can be used. And your book also mentions these, the graphic interchange format versus a JPEG versus a PDF, and how those file sizes, depending on your losslessness or lossiness of the document once it's scanned, and also what you need to be able to do with it. When I scan documents at work, I almost always make sure they're in a PDF format. For me, that just works better, but the scanner does both, and so I oftentimes have to check, because if it comes in a TIFF, I have a TIFF when it comes into a TIFF. It's much harder for me with what I do with those documents to manipulate and use it. So some hardware and software. What is the type of scanner for the job? The first thing you need to know when you're starting to do this estimate, it's just like workflow, right? What are we going to use, where, and when? At the registration desk, you might have the need for two types of scanners. You might have one that can do insurance cards and ID cards, which might be smaller, and you might also have a larger flatbed scanner that might be doing some other type of document scanning. Excuse me. Also, the portability of that scanner. Sometimes the smaller scanner will do the job, the bar scanner, the long, narrow scanners, versus a big flatbed if you've got it on a portable device that you're trying to go from room to room. So again, registration might be going room to room in the ER to do bedside registration. That scanning device needs to be portable. It can't be one of those big, bulky flatbed, but maybe just for the ID cards, because they can scan those at the bedside, and any bigger documentation could be scanned at a later time. That's also something else to think about. What documents should be scanned right now, potentially on the floor in the patient care area, versus what documents could be scanned later on by medical records. And we'll talk a little bit more about that in a moment. So flatbed scanners. Flatbed scanners are good for one page at a time. And in areas where you might have funny sized documents, odd shapes, potentially more wrinkled documents, we talked about how flatbed was maybe the better choice. It also takes up more space. So you've got to weigh the lesser of two. If you've got a multifunction, maybe, or a printer or copy machine nearby, maybe it's easier to photocopy again You could photocopy and feed it through a feeder. Single versus multi-page. Depending on your software application, down below we're talking about pull scan versus push scan. If you're trying to get several pieces of paper through at once, and you need to be able to do a multi-page scan because of the way the application you're using feeds it in. It's going to feed all of those pages through, collate them or spool them, and then take and scan it. If it's push scanning, you'll want it to come in all as one file, so you want to be able to do multi-page. Multi-page is also necessary for efficiency, and then understanding the size of the multi-page that you can do at one time. And that's what in our medical records department, they might be doing several hundreds of pages at the same time. Where in a single scan, it might be being able to name each page individually or something depending on the application. So you'll want to do the pull scan and be able to identify each document prior to scanning it. You don't want to do more than one page at a time. You don't want it to scan until you tell it when and where to scan. Also, the number of pages. It's one thing to have a multi-page scanner that can hold 10 to 20 pages versus something in a medical records department that potentially can have hundreds of pages. It's also important to understand if that technology comes with the ability to do barcode scanning. So at Community, I can tell you that we have documents, all of our documents that we use in-house that are still paper have barcodes on them. And the application software and the device that's doing the scanning is able to read that barcode, and it can tell who the patient is, which specific encounter or financial number or date of service that the patient was in on, and also where in the event set hierarchy, where in the patient's chart, what folder in the patient's chart to file that document under. And of course, this increases a lot of efficiency because you could put several different document types for several different patients in the scanner all at the same time and press the button, and it will automatically put it where it needs to go, which is great. Network capability. Some scanners are recommended for particular types of applications, but they may or may not be network capable. Also, even if it's network compatible, it may not work for the type of scanning that needs to be done and how that scanner needs to be used, and you may need to intervene with a document server of some type. So I had an application that I used to handle, a medical records application where even though the scanner had some networks capability, the application couldn't function that way. It had to, and it also couldn't handle it at the local level on the device, which caused two problems. The first was the way we had to network it and assign an IP address, which we needed a middleman, a document server that would actually manage the IP address and the connection to the application. Then also what that limited us on is we are actually using the software for the document server instead of the software for the scanner. So it really limited all of those auto correction things I talked about in the software where you could straighten the page or you could clean up the background. I couldn't do that because the software with the document server was pretty generic. Basically, you set your dots per inch, your DPI, and a couple of other fine-tuning things, and that was all. You didn't have the ability to do some of the fancier things like straightening and lightening backgrounds and such. The pull scan versus push scan. We talked a little bit about that up when we were talking about the single versus multi-page. Very important. That same software application that I supported for a while, we got big multi-function printer, copier, fax machines in it. It was great, but they only push scan. I could not pull scan from those multi-functions, and so therefore I had to have two separate scanners in the department. This big expensive multi-page fax copy, multi-function fax copy printer, but I couldn't use it for the type of scanning I needed to do for the application. It was great if I wanted to push scan to email. So if I had a document and I wanted to scan it and send it to myself via email, I could do that. But I couldn't be in the software and pull. And that's where I wanted to be in the patient's chart, title the document, and then from the application, press the magic scan button. Push scanning is you're at the device, the scanner itself, and you push the scan button on the device, not within the application you're using. And then it feeds it through to the right place. So those are things to consider. How is what is the job that's trying to be done? What's the end result? How is it going to be used? And then we talked just now about how that situation with a multifunction printer, scan, copy versus a dedicated scanner that you may need to consider in certain areas. Indexing and retrieval. So it's very important on how this indexing is going to happen, and your book talks a little bit about this. What I'd like to elaborate on is where you're going to store it. And again, you may have something set up at the organization where it can scan directly to a file share or a batch scan, and then some other application software is going to pick that up and do something else with it, whether it's billing. A lot of patient billing is done that way. You're scanning in fee tickets and then to an FTP or a file share that another application is able to pick up and do something different with. Hierarchy within a specific chart. So the first thing is how you're going to scan the document, but the second thing is how you're going to identify it and what that workflow looks like to display it within the chart. And for instance, some of the challenges we have right now are if a document isn't labeled just right, or that barcode I talked about isn't quite right, we've got physician notes when they're electronically created, meaning the doctor goes in and uses a template and clicks about in the template to do his documentation, versus when a doctor actually dictates. There's a few reasons why we have doctors actually dictating into a microphone and having it transcribed, and the ability of where that's indexed in the chart, because all the physician's notes should be relatively together or should be labeled as an H&P or a review of systems, but unfortunately this transcribed documents can come into a different place in the chart, and it makes it more difficult to organize and to train people how to find that information. Things like discharge instructions, because the application itself has a specific place for discharge instructions. If we're to give the patient any other form of education and we need to scan it in, it's going to be in a different place in the chart. EKGs that are electronic have their own place in the chart. They're really easy to find right under a cardiology folder. However, if you go to scan an EKG in, we need to make sure we put it in that same place, or it won't be able to be seen if it ends up in another folder and not chosen correctly by the person scanning, which is also a challenge back in that attention to detail. So it's what your document looks like, preparing it before scanning, and understanding where you're going to scan it into, picking the correct name of the document when you scan it in so that it can be indexed for easy retrieval. Some other challenges then with backup and archiving, what does that look like? If you don't have it well indexed, you might just have a whole bunch of documents out there somewhere, and really bad association. They might not be not have good file names or not be associated directly to a patient, and so if you ever had to retrieve them, it would be very inefficient and a lot of work to try to go find those documents. So retrieval looks like, what does it look like when you have this big medical record and some of the documents are scanned and they're scanned in different areas? How do you print a single document? You need to understand where it's indexed so that you can understand how to print that single document, both for creating the audit trail according to the high-tech standards, so that a name and date gets associated with who it was that retrieved that single document, versus printing the entire medical record and how that looks like when it's indexed. We had an issue where we were trying to print out this ER information, and if you just selected ED documents and the physicians hadn't had the correct file type or location folder selected when they created the document, then the people that were getting this medical record information were missing information, basically, because it wasn't pulling from the right place, because it wasn't indexed appropriately. Also, printing the entire medical record, the challenge is when we're trying to create this medical record in a printed form is making sure we've got all those pieces, parts again. So if that EKG scanned in the wrong place, or we're used to be able to press print because all of the stuff that's created within the hospital, we know it's very well organized and we know exactly how it's going to print out, or we go look for that discharge instruction because we know right where it's supposed to be because it was created electronically, but the scanned documents don't fall into the same folder hierarchy, and so we have to be able to understand when we're looking for the entire medical record, is there more than one place we have to go to print that? Or if we're looking for discharge instructions, that we know exactly where the 2 or 3 places are we need to go, so we're sure we get all the information when it's requested from us. And then electronic forwarding of the medical record, that speaks back to this billing issue we had where we needed to be able to only pull out certain pieces of information to be sent to, say, the doctor's office on a regular basis, or potentially whenever a patient's seen in a hospital, their primary care provider is supposed to get a summary of the patient's visit. But if that isn't indexed properly, whether it's scanned or whether it's electronically created, then when you electronically forward that information, you might get missed information or confusing information, and it doesn't make logical sense. So it's very important to know how those scanned documents are going to be used, the importance of those scanned documents, and where you're going to find them, so that you can have continuity of patient care. So a little bit about document imaging and problem solving, and we didn't touch a whole lot on problem solving, but we're going to get more into that. Most of that comes from your service desk chapter that we talked about. You're going to get more networking. So those are the kinds of things we always talk about. So just briefly, is it on? Is it plugged in? Have you turned it off and on? Are you sure you're connected? Do you have the right IP address? Is it on the network? Is the paper jam? Is there a paper jam somewhere? So those are some basic problem solving. So in summary, there's many types of documents that do not have a way to integrate with an electronic medical record or electronic health record, but they can be integrated into those records in the form of a scanned document. Document preparation and attention to detail increases the likelihood of a legible scan, which is important for that continuity of patient care. File size is important for not only quality, so the quality of the image that you're going to get after it's scanned, but also for storage and storage estimates. Knowing the type of documents to be scanned helps determine the file type. So in this area, you're scanning photos, and in that area, you might be scanning just text. The type of hardware and software is important in project planning. Understanding the use of the hardware and how the software integrates together is important prior to making those decisions. How and where documents are stored is important for being able to retrieve those documents. Understanding how the stored documents will be used and accessed is important before designing storage and retrieval workflows. Thanks. Have a great day.